Over 300 years ago, what was known as the Darien scheme finally came to an end. But what was the Darien scheme? And why are the effects of this scheme still with us today? Well, the scheme gets its name from the Gulf of Darien, a relatively sheltered part of the Caribbean Sea, wedged in between Panama and Colombia. Along the coastal shore of Panama is an outcrop of land which further protects a bay, for which a brief time was called the Bay of Caledonia. Associated with this bay are some nearby small islands. This area was selected by the country of Scotland as a suitable area for colonisation. However, things went rather badly wrong. But before I go into the details, I need to explain some of what's going on in both Scotland and Europe around about the same time. So starting with Europe, many European countries have found that expanding their territories within Europe led to expensive and dangerous clashes with other powerful European countries. Networks of changing alliances often meant that these conflicts could easily involve many different nations. Instead of expanding within Europe, some of the major seafaring powers like Spain and England started to create colonies in what was thought of as the New World, now known as the Americas. It often did involve conflicts with locals, but in general these were not as dangerous as conflicts with other European powers. Now, some of these colonies fell through disease, hunger, mismanagement, or even conflict with the locals. However, others were spectacular successes and brought in spices, gold, silver, many other valuable commodities to the founding nations. Now, some of these successful colonies, however, did then become targets for rival European powers. The reason being, if you risk setting up your own colony, you need to take over somebody else's operation. However, in the early part of the colonisation era, there was so much new land and the colonies were generally quite far apart, so the conflicts that did happen tended to be as much more of a general conflict back in Europe rather than being specific in the New World. Talking of conflicts back in Europe, the independent country of Scotland had been involved in a lot of these over the years. Many of these about regaining their independence from England or about religion. Most recent of these was the attempt of the Jacobite Rising of 1689, where some of the Scots wanted to put King James back on the throne of Scotland rather than William of Orange. Background dispute is very complicated. The relevant part of the Darien scheme is that by marriage and inheritance, the King of Scotland and the King of England this time happened to be the same person. Now, even though this time both England and Scotland had the same king, these were separate countries with their own parliaments, laws, and taxation systems. However, economically, Scotland was far less developed than England, had a far smaller population. In addition, transport from one part of Scotland to another was extremely difficult. This became a major problem around this time as climatic conditions, which were never really ideal for farming in Scotland, took a turn for the worse. Changing climate conditions also affected many other northern European countries. The situation in Scotland was made worse by trade disputes with France and some other local factors. And the price of food went up dramatically. A result of a series of poor harvests in Scotland was widespread hunger and starvation. Because food was difficult to move around Scotland, a vast number of the population tried to move to find work or food, some heading to Northern Ireland, others to England, or even out to the new colonies. The government of Scotland found it increasingly difficult to look after its population, with masses of poor people coming at a significant drain on the resources of such a relatively small country. As maybe a fifth of the population, around 200,000 people, were on the move. The Scots, however, were still an inventive and ambitious nation. The government undertook extensive land reforms and agricultural improvements which increased the farming output. These steps would take some time to actually work. The Scots also saw, however, that England and some other nations had made some spectacular successes at founding colonies in the New World. They thought, with the spare population that Scotland now had, they could set up a colony of their own. This is where the Darien scheme came in. A group of investors backed setting up a settlement on the coast of Panama, trying to follow the model of the East India Company that investors in England had used to exploit the resources in India. With consent of the Scottish Parliament, they set up the Company of Scotland, so granting monopolies on trade, exemptions from taxation, and sovereign rights to overseas territories. Huge sums of money were raised for the 5 ships the company would need to transport the colonists and their equipment to the New World. This money came from both rich individual investors as well as companies and institutions within Scotland. The colony was established with fortifications near the natural harbour and huts constructed for the colonists. It was a start made on clearing the land and on planting crops. Local native tribes were fairly scarce in the area, weren't hostile to new arrivals, and even traded with them and gave them some gifts of food. However, this could have been taken as a warning. Natives were relatively friendly, partially as the Scots weren't the really disliked Spanish invaders, and also the land was unable to support a large native population, so the Scots might actually struggle to survive themselves. Positive reports, though, were sent back about the establishment of the colony, and a new series of settlers were dispatched to the colony. However, all was far from well. Much of the food for the colonists had spoiled as it was being transported across the Atlantic. The colonists were suffering from dysentery and malaria. The local land was really too swampy for large-scale farming, or sort of a natural harbour had dangerous tides and rocks which could damage the hulls of the ships. On top of all this, the Spanish were determined that no other country should take up a new colony what they regarded as their territory, especially as the cannon on the ships and the fortifications could potentially be turned on the Spanish ships that were sailing in the area. In order not to antagonize the Spanish, the English decided not to trade or help resupply this new Scottish colony. After the arrival of a new series of colonies, the Spanish decided to forcibly remove the Scottish from what they regarded as their territory. And even though the Spanish troops were also suffering from malaria and dysentery, the difference in strengths between the two sides was far too great. There was some spirited defence for a while, led by Alexander Campbell. Once he was wounded and struck down with a fever, there was no way the Scots could survive. And after some negotiation, the Scots agreed to leave the area. So the whole Darien scheme came to an abrupt end. Most of the colonists dead of disease, nearly all the money invested was lost, and even the surviving ships were lost in attempts using them for the Atlantic trade. Now, the wider problem for Scotland was that since such a huge proportion of the wealth of Scotland had been invested in the scheme, the already suffering economy of Scotland was in a disastrous state. The Scottish government then tried to turn to the only country likely to bail them out of the hole that they got themselves into, which was England. The financial aid and assistance lent to Scotland by the English included stabilising the Scottish currency by tying it to the English currency. Now, many of the ruling class in Scotland thought that rather than by trying to set up their own colonies, much better off joining with England and their already widely established and very profitable colonies. This merging of the two economies eventually led to the 1707 Parliamentary Acts of Union, which united the country of Scotland and the country of England into one kingdom of Great Britain. The Acts of Union merged the two parliaments into a single body based in London, allowed free trade between England and Scotland, along with the introduction of a common currency, but did, however, allow Scotland to keep their separate legal system. So without the failure of the Darien scheme and the help Scotland received after it, the benefits that both Scotland and England have obtained from their close relationship down the years may not have actually happened.